Wait, Sarah passed away. I received a call while I was taking care of my daughter Sarah's child. According to the police, Sarah and her husband, Spencer, were hit by a car while crossing an intersection, and soon after, they passed away. The sudden news left me in shock. My heart raced, and I felt dizzy. Sarah, who had been laughing with us just a few hours ago. I rushed to confirm the news, and from that point on, there was no time to grieve as I was overwhelmed with various procedures. During this time, a discussion about the future of Sarah's triplets with Spencer's parents, Susan and Isaac, came up. When I asked Susan and Isaac about what would happen to Sarah and Spencer's children, Susan said something unbelievable. "What should we do with the kids? They're a hassle, maybe put them in a facility?" I wondered if my ears were deceiving me. The feeling of disbelief filled my heart. During Sarah's life, the triplets had lived with their grandparents on their father's side. Despite us, the grandparents, not seeing them as often, our emotional attachment to the grandchildren should have been much deeper. Aren't you worried about the future of your adorable grandchildren? They should adore them so much. It's all right. My husband and I will take care of Sarah and Spencer's children with all our love. Nearly 20 years have passed since then. Though we faced many challenges, I am proud that all three have grown into fine adults. I never forgot the sadness of losing Sarah and Spencer, but I always thought of living happily for their sake too. Then one day, the doorbell rang suddenly. When I opened the door, there stood Susan and Isaac, whom I hadn't seen in years. Ignoring my surprise, Susan and Isaac entered and faced the triplets. Then they said something unbelievable. "Would you like to live with us again? My name is Kennedy. My husband, Harold, was my high school classmate, and we started dating then and got married after becoming working adults. At the age of 27, we were blessed with a child. Her name was Sarah. As our only daughter, we devoted all our love to her, and Sarah grew up to be a bright and energetic child. When Sarah became a college student, after some time, she came to us with her boyfriend Spencer, who was a year older than her, saying they had something to talk about. Mom, I'd like you to keep the end of this month, Sunday, free. Dad too. We have something we want to discuss. It's about Spencer and me." "Eh? The end of this month?" "Sure, Harold has the day off, so that's fine, but what's it about?" "I'll explain everything then. Sorry, but please make sure you're free that day. And tell Dad not to go fishing." I was curious about what was going on, but Sarah wouldn't say more until the day. Lost in a whirlwind of thoughts, I awaited the day. When it finally arrived, Sarah mentioned that the discussion would be at Spencer's family home, which I somewhat expected. Such occasions, where both families come together to talk, are rare after all. Never having met Spencer's parents before, my nerves were barely concealed as we made our way to their house. "Nice to meet you, I'm Spencer's mother. Please, come in." "Nice to meet you. We appreciate your hospitality." We were greeted by Spencer's mother, Susan. My nervousness only grew with Susan's monotone voice, as it didn't seem very welcoming. Upon entering their house, it was clear from the get-go that something was off. Spencer's father, Isaac, and Spencer were already seated, and an uneasy atmosphere hung in the air. We sat down in front of Spencer's family, ready to listen. Then, slowly, Spencer began to speak. "Sarah and I are expecting a child. We apologize for the sudden news, but please allow us to marry and have this child." Despite his nervousness, Spencer made sure to look us in the eyes as he spoke. They were not yet married, and both were still students. You could tell he expected opposition, his voice trembling slightly. After Spencer finished, silence ensued. Gathering my courage, I voiced my concerns about them proceeding with the pregnancy. Do you understand what it means to have a child? What about school? How do you plan to support yourselves? You've never worked before, it's more challenging than you think. Following that, Spencer's parents, Susan and Isaac, also opposed, deeming them too young. Don't be ridiculous. You're still children yourselves, talking about marriage? And a baby. Who do you think has been paying for your education? You ingrates. Their words were a torrent of anger. However, Sarah and Spencer's determination was much stronger than expected, unwavering in their decision to have the baby. After much discussion, Sarah and Spencer pleaded with us again. Please! We've talked about this over and over, promising to overcome any hardship together. Please! Hearing Sarah's almost disappearing voice stirred something in me. Sarah had always been such a good child, never once demanding. And now, for the first time, she was conveying her wishes to us with all her might. Although I initially opposed, as we talked more, I could see their resolve was genuine. Still somewhat anxious, I decided to support their decision to marry and have the baby, if that was what Sarah had decided. Sarah seemed relieved by my support, but Spencer's parents remained steadfastly opposed. If you absolutely cannot accept it, then Spencer and I will cut ties. That way, we won't be a burden, right? Sensing the conversation was going nowhere, Spencer quietly made his stance clear. Spencer, isn't that a bit too drastic? Let's think this over calmly. Shocked, I gently urged Spencer to reconsider. I know it sounds drastic, but if this is the only way. Startled by the mention of cutting ties, Susan and Isaac seemed to hesitate, taking a moment to think. They requested a brief consultation together, moving to a different location. I caught glimpses of them whispering and casting glances our way, from the corner of my eye. After a short while, Susan and Isaac returned to us, sharing a smug smile before presenting their decision. They would allow the marriage and pregnancy, but with conditions. The initial relief of their acceptance was quickly overshadowed by the word conditions, making everyone but Susan and Isaac tense. The stipulation was that Sarah and Spencer must live with Spencer's parents at their home. Additionally, we, Sarah's parents, were to provide Susan and Isaac with living expenses for Sarah. The thought of Sarah, who had never lived on her own, much less with her Mael, filled me with apprehension. What's the matter? Any complaints? If you can't accept these terms, then we won't approve of the pregnancy or the marriage. And of course, we'll categorically refuse to cut ties with Spencer. What will it be, Sarah? Susan's confrontational tone caused Sarah to look down. Okay. Thank you for your approval. Sarah reluctantly agreed after some thought. The anxious look on Sarah's face made me feel a twinge of sadness. Though my worries never fully dissipated, seeing Spencer gently support Sarah, I decided to keep a watchful eye on them for a while. Soon, Sarah and Spencer proceeded to drop out of college. To support their upcoming child, Spencer started working at a company owned by a friend of Harold, while Sarah assisted with piecework and household chores under Susan, her future Mael. Harold, who had introduced Spencer to the job despite having no work experience, initially inquired about his progress out of concern. Contrary to Harold's worries, Spencer was well regarded at his workplace. Spencer seems to be doing really well at work. I'm quite proud. Harold spoke with pride, showing how diligently Spencer worked and seriously saved money. Our initial anxiety gradually transformed into a growing sense of reassurance about Sarah and Spencer. Time passed, and Sarah safely gave birth to triplets. When I first heard it was triplets, I was so surprised that I kept asking Sarah if there was a mistake, a memory that still stands vividly in my mind. I don't know anyone in my circle who has had triplets, and I've heard that multiple pregnancies carry higher risks compared to singleton pregnancies. Amidst these concerns, the days were filled with worry about whether they would be born safely, but the triplets were developing well in Sarah's womb. When they were born, they were incredibly adorable, truly becoming the apple of my eye. Nancy was the first to arrive, the only girl among them. Her eyes were big and beautifully double-lidded, a very charming little girl right from the start. Then came Tanner, the smallest at birth, making us hope he would grow strong and healthy. Lastly was Taylor, who consumed the most milk, making Sarah feel he was robust. Sarah and Spencer cherished their children deeply, and we, as grandparents, frequently visited Isaac's house to dote on them. After giving birth to the triplets, Sarah started working a part-time job the following year. Spencer, wanting to provide more for his adorable children and Sarah, changed jobs to earn more, working harder than before. Seeing Sarah's family come together joyfully reminded me of Sarah's childhood. I deeply wished for their happiness to last forever. One day, Sarah's family planned to visit our home. Harold was looking forward to playing with our grandchildren from the morning. I was excited too, with the table laden with their favorite snacks and toys. Soon, the doorbell rang, and there stood Sarah, Spencer, and the triplets. "Hello, Grandma and Grandpa." Tanner, who was small at birth, had grown into a lively boy. Taylor ran after Tanner into the living room. Nancy, being the only girl, seemed a bit shy compared to her brothers. Seeing Nancy, Harold crouched to her level, offering his hand. "Hello, Nancy. There are some sweets over there, shall we go together?" Comforted by Harold's gentle voice, Nancy took his hand and walked towards the living room. Spencer followed them, and Sarah and I walked behind. Unexpectedly, Sarah stopped. I turned around, wondering why she had paused. "Mom, there's something I want to talk about, just the two of us." Seeing her unusually serious face, I felt a slight unease. "Okay. Shall we talk in your room, then?" We went to the room Sarah used before moving out. Sarah sat on the bed, and I took a seat on a chair. Then, looking determined, Sarah started to speak. "Once the kids turn 5, I'm thinking of moving out from my in-laws' house." "What's wrong? Did something happen?" I had never heard any complaints or grievances from Sarah, who had lived with her in-laws until now. Sarah began to speak quietly and, after confiding in me, left to join her children. Later, Sarah and Spencer asked us to watch the kids for a few hours as they wanted to look for a new place to live after moving out of the in-laws' house. "Of course. Take some time for yourselves," I encouraged. With a smile and a pat on their children's heads, Sarah and Spencer left the house. It had been quite some time since Sarah's family arrived, so Nancy, who was initially nervous, was now engrossed in the toys we had prepared. Tanner and Taylor were playing together with block toys. I was all set to keep them entertained until Sarah and Spencer returned. How many hours had passed since they left? I was starting to worry when I glanced at the clock, and just then, the phone rang. A bad feeling washed over me as I rushed to answer it. It was the police on the line. "Eh? Yes, that's me. Yes. Yes. Eh? Okay, understood." The police officer's voice seemed so distant as I hung up the phone in shock. Harold, sensing something was wrong, came over and shook my shoulder. "What's wrong? You look pale." "It's Sarah and Spencer." My voice trembled as I explained that Sarah and Spencer had been in an accident. They were hit by a car while crossing an intersection and had died instantly. How could I possibly explain this to their innocent children still playing joyfully? The mere thought brought tears to my eyes. Harold and I hurried to the hospital to start the necessary procedures and confirmations. Harold's hand on my shoulder was trembling, making the reality all the more poignant. After confirming Sarah and Spencer's death, we were swamped with arrangements without even a moment to grieve. There were endless visits to the police and municipal offices, funeral arrangements, and notifying relatives. At Sarah and Spencer's funeral, friends and Spencer's colleagues mourned their untimely deaths, highlighting how beloved they were. It struck me how fortunate they were to have such a supportive community. While Harold and I were busy with funeral staff and attendees, Susan and Isaac were surrounded by acquaintances, shedding endless tears. Despite our own sadness, we were just trying to stay strong amidst the overwhelming pain. I muttered to myself, heartbroken. During the hectic funeral, Susan's promise to raise the triplets well was the only thing that offered me a sliver of comfort, showing her caring heart for them. Even after the funeral ended, the busy days continued without a break, especially with taking care of the grandchildren. Since the day Sarah and Spencer had their accident, the triplets have been living with us. We didn't tell them directly about their parents' passing, just that they wouldn't be seeing them anymore. Even though they're young, they must find it strange not to see their parents return after a whole day. Understanding they won't see their beloved parents again, tears welled up in Nancy's eyes, the eldest. Tanner and Taylor, perhaps not fully grasping the situation, looked at crying Nancy with curiosity and gently patted her head. "What's wrong? Are you hurt? Shall I bring you some medicine?" The boys, especially being protective of Nancy, the only girl, asked her gently. They must feel it's their duty to protect her, even unconsciously. Embracing these kind-hearted three, I too shed tears. Harold and I had never spent a night with these children before. Perhaps out of consideration for their in-laws, Sarah and her family had never stayed over at our house. We were completely unfamiliar with their meal schedules, nap times, or how to put them to bed. Everything was uncharted territory, leaving Harold and me feeling overwhelmed. Tanner and Taylor probably started to sense something was wrong, realizing they couldn't see their beloved parents. They became anxious and started crying. I wanted to stay close to Nancy, who hadn't smiled since the accident. But there were too many urgent tasks to handle. I tried calling Susan and Isaac, hoping they could share some of the burden. Hello? I was hoping to ask for your help with some arrangements." Susan's response over the phone was cold. "Eh? Oh, we're not really knowledgeable about that. You'd probably handle it more smoothly, right?" We had never spent a night with these children before. To be honest, we weren't experts either. We were just trying our best because it needed to be done. However, no matter how much we pleaded, it seemed they couldn't help with the various tasks. "Could you at least stay with the children until we finish the procedures? They must be missing you," I asked. "No, we're quite busy ourselves. Honestly, we don't have the capacity," was their response. "But please." "I'm sorry, we have to go now." And with that, the call was abruptly ended. Further attempts to ask for their help over the phone were unsuccessful. No good response ever came. Struggling with the grief of losing Sarah and Spencer, Harold and I managed all the arrangements and took care of the grandchildren, truly exhausted. What remained was the discussion about the division of the estate and custody. Susan and Isaac had not shown their faces since they left their belongings at our house, up until the day of the discussions. I remembered how much they adored their first grandchildren. Now understanding their parents were gone, the once lively boys had become withdrawn. Harold and I couldn't escape our sorrow, continuing to live in a heavy atmosphere. Exhausted from all the arrangements, I hoped the discussions would proceed smoothly. On the day of the discussion, Susan and Isaac arrived at our house and were led to the living room. Just going to talk for a bit, can you play here? I said to Tanner, the eldest, who obediently took Taylor and Nancy to another room. When I first brought up the future of the children, Susan immediately started discussing the estate. Susan argued that since they had taken care of Sarah's family, all the assets should go to them. Holding back my urge to confront her priority over assets rather than the children, I tried to steer the conversation back to the kids. Then Susan said something unbelievable. "The kids are too much trouble. How about putting them in a facility?" I doubted my ears. Sarah's children, whom we've lovingly raised, are her precious treasures. Just like Sarah, we hold the belief that these adorable grandchildren are invaluable to us. But it seemed Susan and Isaac stood on a different ground. Without any sign of remorse, they made shocking statements, escalating my distrust. They pushed all the troubles onto us while demanding the estate, simply because they had lived together in the past. Remembering what Sarah confided in me, I clenched my fist in anger. Then, I slowly began to speak. "Sarah's children will be taken care of by us. We'll discuss the estate later." Despite my firm tone, Susan and Isaac kept insisting on transferring the estate rights to them, expecting to gain control today. Their disregard for their grandchildren, who they once adored, turned my anger into dismay and sadness. What was the meaning of their promise at the funeral to raise the triplets well? Their current behavior made it clear that those words were just for show. I wanted to confront them but refrained, weighed down by the grief of losing Sarah and Spencer and the exhaustion from all the procedures. Of course, taking in our grandchildren was not an issue for us. It might take some time to adjust, but we were confident in our love and care for them. As Susan and Isaac continued to talk about the estate, I quietly resolved in my heart. Impatient with the unproductive discussion, they eventually left our house, adamant about not handing over the estate. Years have passed since Sarah and Spencer died, almost 2 decades. I still remember the joy of legally adopting the triplets. Had these precious children remained with Susan and Isaac, I shudder to think how they might have been treated. The thought alone fills me with dread. We've subtly informed the triplets about becoming estranged from Susan and Isaac. The fact that they were never taken in or visited by them is something I fear would hurt them, and I've still not managed to express it directly. Throughout my explanation, none of them looked particularly sad, simply acknowledging with a "we understand." Without their parents, they might have felt lonely during school activities or when interacting with mom friends, struggling with things they couldn't do well. Yet, all 3 have grown up to be such honest and wonderful children, not letting those challenges affect them. Now, they truly feel like my own children. Carrying on Sarah and Spencer's legacy, we were living peaceful days with the triplets when one day, the doorbell rang. Opening the door, I was surprised to find Susan and Isaac standing there. "Hello. It's been a while," Isaac greeted as if the years hadn't affected him. "Oh, it's been a long time. What brings you here all of a sudden?" Ignoring my bewildered reaction, Susan and Isaac entered our house as if it was a matter of course. I hurried after them, taking a good look at their backs for the first time in years. Since then, Susan and Isaac had contacted us a few times about the estate, but they had never once come to see the grandchildren. I had pleaded with them to visit the grieving children, even if just briefly, but busy schedules and other excuses always got in the way, and they never accepted. Our communication dwindled over time, and seeing each other now was truly rare. It seems we've both aged quite a bit, perhaps feeling mutual about this. Susan, leaning on a cane, stood with Isaac's support. I ushered them into the guest room and then briefly explained the situation to Taylor, who was in the living room. "I've got another set of grandparents visiting. Could you fetch Nancy and Tanner for greetings? Are they the ones you mentioned were estranged from?" "Yes, that's them. I wonder what they want." Muttering in confusion, Taylor went off to fetch Nancy and Tanner from his room. Shortly after, led by Taylor, Nancy and Tanner joined us in the guest room. Upon seeing the grown triplets, Susan and Isaac immediately showed a gentle smile, grasping Tanner's hand warmly. "You've grown so much," as Susan fondly stroked Tanner's hand. I was stunned, but Susan, undeterred by my reaction, made an unbelievable proposal. "Why don't we live together again, like old times?" This unexpected suggestion left everyone but Susan and Isaac wide-eyed. Why now, after all this time? If they wanted to live together, why did they push the triplets away back then? They weren't there when the kids truly needed someone. They hadn't shown their faces for so long. Overwhelmed with too many unspoken thoughts, I couldn't decide what to say first. Without a word from me or the triplets, Susan pressed on. "You know, my legs have been quite bad lately. Isaac's been supporting me, but we never know what might happen to us, right? It would be reassuring to have you by our side." At first, I thought they wanted to reconnect now that the grandchildren were grown and less of a burden, but it seemed not to be the case. Were they planning to use these children for their own care after abandoning them so heartlessly before? After abandoning their precious grandchildren like that, how dare they speak so opportunistically now? I was beyond exasperated by their unchanged demeanor, speechless but determined not to let these children be exploited. Yet, before I could voice my objection, it was Tanner who spoke up. "Who are you? Can you leave if you're going to be a bother?" Tanner, looking annoyed, shook off Susan's grasp. In agreement with Tanner, Nancy and Taylor also looked sternly at Susan and Isaac. Surprised by the unexpected resistance, Susan and Isaac showed their anger. Then Susan pointed at me, accusing. "She's the one who tore you away from us. We wanted to live together, but it wasn't possible because of her." The grandchildren, noticing the lack of sincerity in Susan and Isaac's words, continued to cast cold glances at them. Over time, they had grown significantly, now looking down on Susan and Isaac simply by standing. Tanner and Taylor stood protectively in front of Nancy and me. Susan and Isaac, disliking this show of defiance from Tanner and Taylor, clenched their jaws tightly. Then, they exclaimed, "They used to be such obedient and good kids before. You've been brainwashed by this too." At that moment, my patience ran thin. Suppressing the urge to shout back in anger, I retrieved something from the drawer and presented it to Susan. "Sarah confided in me before her passing. This was given to me at that time." Recalling Sarah's pained expression that day, my voice deepened. "It's all written here, how harshly you treated Sarah. Just before her accident, Sarah had handed me a small diary. It contained dates and entries, resembling a journal. Initially, I had only skimmed through its pages. After Sarah and Spencer's death, as life gradually became more manageable, I remembered the diary and read it carefully, page by page. The entries detailed how Susan exploited Sarah's guilt over their shotgun marriage and her student status, treating her poorly. Sarah endured in silence, unable to share her struggles with anyone. As her pregnancy progressed and her appetite increased, Susan complained about the rising food expenses and reduced Sarah's portions. Behind Sarah and Spencer's backs, money was taken from their wallets and accounts. The diary detailed various abuses Sarah had suffered at the hands of Susan and Isaac. Some pages were smudged with what seemed like tears, illustrating how deeply Sarah was affected every day. Susan and Isaac hesitantly took the diary, read the first page, then immediately closed it, choosing not to read further. Their reaction confirmed the truth of the contents written within. Although I hesitated to speak of the painful circumstances in front of the triplets, the thought of them possibly being exploited by Susan and Isaac compelled me to share the testimonies Sarah had entrusted to me. Sarah had confided in me painfully about her struggles. How her heart eroded with each act of forbearance, and her frustration at not being able to get along with Susan. Remembering Sarah's plight, I felt my grip tighten. How much Sarah suffered! Those words I had directed at myself. Wondering why I hadn't noticed Sarah's struggles until she confided in me. Despite seeing the diary, Susan claimed not to remember any such thing, showing no signs of apology or remorse. Faced with Susan and Isaac's persistent request to live together again, I sighed deeply. Holding back tears of anger at Susan and Isaac, and at myself for not recognizing Sarah's pain, Nancy gently patted my back. The triplets, even at their young age, faintly remembered Susan being harsh towards Sarah. Nancy, especially being a mama's girl, was always by Sarah's side at home. She distinctly remembered Susan's stern behavior towards Sarah, particularly when Spencer wasn't around. The one clear memory she had was that Sarah often looked sad after talking with Susan. Nancy shared her frustration about being unable to do anything as a child living with Susan and Isaac. I was taken aback as they had never spoken of these things until now. Perhaps sparing Harold and me any worry. At the same time, I felt a surge of anger knowing that Susan was harsh towards Sarah even in front of her young children. Nancy stood beside Tanner and Taylor, all with determined looks, stating, "We don't want to live with such people." Echoing Tanner's sentiments, Taylor and Nancy showed agreement. Following Tanner, I spoke up. "I cannot hand over these precious children to you." I stated my position clearly. Yet, despite our insistence, Susan and Isaac kept pushing to live together with the triplets. Their desperation was evident, likely because their situation wasn't going as planned. Their physical strength seemed to be waning, probably affecting their daily lives. I could empathize with Susan and Isaac's feelings to some extent, as I too have felt the effects of aging. And I knew how significant the support of these children can be during tough times. But the idea of exploiting my precious children for convenience was intolerable. The triplets had been calm during our discussions, but eventually, they showed their anger. "When our parents died, you wanted to send us away to an institution because we were too much trouble." They vaguely remembered. That they remembered such a thing pained my heart. Despite their denials, Taylor countered with a reminder of their own words. "I'll return those exact words to you now. Please leave. If you can't handle it, perhaps you should go to an institution?" Following Taylor, Tanner repeated those words. Nancy, showing a strong resolve, also stared down Susan and Isaac. These children, once dismissed as a nuisance 17 years ago, were now returning those words to Susan and Isaac as accomplished adults. Their words made me feel the significance of how Harold and I had raised the triplets together. While I felt a sense of clarity, Susan and Isaac's frustration only deepened. It was thought that Tanner and Taylor's words would finally make them give up, but against expectations, Susan and Isaac only showed irritation without any signs of remorse. "Spencer was supposed to take care of us. Now that he's gone, it's only natural you should do it, right?" "Yeah. And if you can't do that, then give us a monthly allowance. Have you forgotten all the care we provided when you were little?" Far from showing any regret, they made even more unreasonable demands. They even demanded payment for the care they had supposedly provided up to that point. I was truly at a loss for words. The lack of compassion from Susan and Isaac was shocking, beyond anything I had anticipated. Frozen in shock, the triplets exchanged looks and sighed. Tanner, who had become a police officer, was the first to speak. "If you make any more trouble, I'll call the police." As an officer, I can assure a prompt response. Nancy, now a lawyer, spoke next. "If you threaten our beloved family like this again, we will take legal action." Susan and Isaac's faces grew paler by the second. Taylor, who worked at the city hall, delivered the final blow. Also, you're behind on your property taxes, aren't you? Seizure proceedings are likely to start soon. Perhaps you have other matters to attend to? Hearing those words, Susan and Isaac exchanged looks, seemingly realizing they had hit a nerve. Susan and Isaac left our home with their heads bowed, their earlier momentum gone. I watched the backs of these three, who have become so dependable. Despite the hardships and the absence of their parents, they've grown into such caring and wonderful adults. Moved to tears by their growth, the triplets comforted me with a gentle hand. After that day, Susan and Isaac never stormed our house again, though they continued to cause trouble at their workplaces, leading to repeated police reports. I had thought they had given up after such a heated discussion. Their persistence left me wondering what to do. Time passed, and then Tanner brought news. The news: Susan and Isaac had been arrested. Isaac reportedly attacked a police officer at Tanner's police station when they were about to be reported again. This constituted a serious obstruction of justice. Including their past nuisances, both were arrested. Relieved by this news, I once again thanked the triplets. Thank you for growing up so admirably. No matter how many times I say it, it never feels enough. It's us who should be thanking you. We're really grateful. Thank you for being there during the hard times. We've grown this much because of you too. They expressed their gratitude to me and Harold. Seeing Sarah's gentle image overlaid on the triplets, I felt profoundly moved. Even months after Susan and Isaac's arrest, the triplets continue to live happily with us, each now with someone special. As they reach the age of considering marriage, the question of who will stay with Harold and me has become a playful contention, ensuring our family enjoys peaceful and harmonious days.